My family basically disowned me because they claimed my successful relationship was making my sister feel inadequate about her dating failures. So they banned me from family gatherings and then boycotted my wedding when I refused to hide my happiness. I never imagined that being content could be such a problem for other people, but apparently I was completely wrong about that. The whole mess began last spring when I brought Marcus to my dad's birthday celebration, and honestly, I should have noticed the red flags immediately, but I was too wrapped up in how wonderfully everything was going in my life to see the storm clouds gathering around me. Marcus and I had been together for about 8 months at that point, and everything felt incredible between us in this natural, effortless way. Like we just clicked without having to pretend or tiptoe around each other's feelings. He made me genuinely laugh every day. And he actually paid attention when I talked about my job or my interests or whatever random thoughts were floating through my mind. And he never made me feel like I was too intense or not interesting enough or anything other than exactly the person I was meant to be. We could talk for hours about meaningful things or complete nonsense. And even the silent moments felt peaceful instead of uncomfortable, and I caught myself eagerly anticipating our time together in ways I'd never experienced with previous partners. So when my dad's 55th birthday rolled around, I was thrilled to introduce Marcus to more of my family since he'd already met my mom and stepdad a couple weeks before, and they were absolutely charmed by him. My mom kept sending me texts afterwards about how courteous and witty he was, and how she could tell just by watching my face light up when I looked at him how happy he made me and my stepdad. Even invited Marcus to go fishing the following weekend, which was basically his ultimate stamp of approval, since he usually takes months to warm up to newcomers. But my dad's side of the family operated differently, and I was aware of that going in because there was always some kind of chaos or tension whenever we all gathered, usually revolving around my half-sister Jessica, who was 28 but still behaved like a teenager most of the time. Jessica had this recurring pattern where she'd become obsessed with guys who were obviously terrible choices for her, like the married coworker who led her on for 6 months before disappearing, or the guy who was still living with his ex but insisted that they were just roommates, or the one who borrowed $3,000 from her and then blocked her phone number when she asked for it back. Every single time Jessica got involved with one of these disasters, she'd call my dad and stepmom sobbing about how she couldn't figure out why this kept happening to her, and they'd abandon everything to rush to her apartment, armed with ice cream and tissues and reassurances that none of it was her fault and she just had terrible luck with men. They'd spend endless hours dissecting every text message and conversation, trying to decode what went wrong and how she could prevent it from happening again. And then they'd trash talk the guy to anyone who would listen while going on about how Jessica deserved so much better than these jerks who couldn't appreciate what an incredible woman she was. The issue was that Jessica never actually learned from these experiences because my dad and stepmom always swooped in to fix everything instead of letting her face the consequences of her decisions. They'd cover her rent when she blew her grocery money on expensive gifts for whatever guy she was chasing, and they'd co-sign loans when her credit got destroyed from all the financial mistakes she made, trying to impress men who didn't give a damn about her, and they'd even let her move back into their house whenever things got really dire, which happened at least twice yearly, like clockwork. So when I walked into my dad's birthday dinner holding Marcus's hand and smiling because I was genuinely excited to be there with him, I assumed everyone would be pleased to see me thriving. For once I'd had my share of relationship catastrophes in my early 20s, including a 2-year engagement that imploded when my fiancé decided he wasn't ready for marriage after all, and I'd spent considerable time single and working on myself before meeting Marcus. So I figured my family would be delighted that I'd found someone who treated me with respect. But the atmosphere in the restaurant felt strange from the moment we sat down, and I couldn't identify what was wrong initially because everyone was being polite and asking Marcus the typical getting-to-know-you questions about his career and background and how we met. Marcus was being his usual charming self, sharing amusing stories about his work as a physical therapist, and asking thoughtful questions about everyone else's lives. And I could see that my dad actually liked him, even though he was trying to play it cool. Jessica was there too, and she'd just been dumped the previous week by some guy she met on a dating app who turned out to be using photos from 5 years ago and had lied about essentially everything in his profile. She'd been texting me constantly about what a nightmare the whole situation was, and how she couldn't believe she'd wasted 2 months talking to this person who wasn't even real, and how she was beginning to think there were no decent men left in the world, and maybe she should just adopt a bunch of cats and give up on romance entirely. I tried to be supportive when she was venting to me about all this, but honestly, I was getting exhausted from having the identical conversation with her repeatedly about how she kept getting involved with obviously problematic guys and then acting shocked when things didn't work out. I never said that to her directly, because I didn't want to be cruel, but I was starting to think that maybe she needed to take a break from dating and figure out why she kept making the same mistakes, instead of immediately jumping back into the same patterns with different people. Anyway, Jessica was sitting across from me at dinner looking miserable and picking at her food, while everyone else was having normal conversations, and I felt bad for her because breakups always suck even when you should have seen them coming. But then Marcus started telling this story about a patient of his who was this elderly man learning to walk again after hip surgery, and how determined and positive the guy was, despite the recovery being really challenging, and I was laughing at the funny parts and just enjoying listening to him talk because he was such a gifted storyteller. That's when my stepmom Linda made this comment about how it must be nice to be so carefree and happy all the time. And there was something in her tone that made me look up from my dinner to see what she meant by that. She was looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite decipher, but it wasn't friendly, and I suddenly realized that Jessica had tears in her eyes and was staring down at her plate, like she was trying not to cry. I felt horrible because I hadn't been thinking about how my happiness might be difficult for Jessica to handle when she was going through a rough patch, so I tried to change the subject and ask her about her new job, but she just shrugged and said it was fine and didn't elaborate. The rest of dinner was awkward after that, with weird silences and forced conversation, and I kept catching Linda and my dad exchanging looks. Marcus and I left as soon as we politely could, and on the drive home he asked me if everything was okay, because the vibe had gotten pretty strange there toward the end. I told him about Jessica's recent breakup, and said I thought maybe I'd been insensitive by being too obviously happy when she was feeling down, and Marcus said he understood, but that I shouldn't have to hide the fact that I was in a good relationship just to make other people feel better about their problems. I thought that was the end of it. But the next morning I got a text from Linda asking if we could talk. So I called her thinking she wanted to discuss what happened at dinner and maybe clear the air. But instead she launched into this whole speech about how she'd been observing my behavior lately, and she was concerned that I was being insensitive to Jessica's struggles by flaunting my relationship in front of her when she was going through such a difficult time. I was confused because I hadn't thought I was flaunting anything, and I told Linda that I was just being myself and sharing my life with my family the same way I always did, but she said that bringing Marcus to family events and talking about our relationship and looking so obviously happy was hurtful to Jessica, who was already feeling bad about herself and her dating life, and that I needed to be more considerate of her feelings. I asked Linda what exactly she wanted me to do about it, and she said that maybe I should tone down the public displays of affection and avoid talking about Marcus so much when Jessica was around, and that I should try to be more supportive of Jessica instead of just focusing on my own happiness all the time. I pointed out that I had been supportive of Jessica through all her relationship drama over the years, and that I'd listened to her vent about her problems countless times without ever making it about me or my own relationships. But Linda said that wasn't the same thing, and that right now Jessica needed extra support from her family because she was going through a particularly rough period with dating, and that it would mean a lot to her if I could just be more sensitive about how I acted around her until she got back on her feet. I said I'd try to be more aware of how I came across, but that I didn't think it was fair to ask me to hide my happiness or pretend my relationship wasn't going well just to protect Jessica's feelings. That conversation bothered me for days afterwards because something about it felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong with Linda's logic. I talked to Marcus about it, and he said it sounded like they were asking me to make myself smaller to accommodate Jessica's issues, which wasn't healthy for anyone involved, but I didn't want to cause problems with my family, so I decided to try to be more low-key about my relationship when I was around them, even though it felt weird and fake. The next family gathering was my cousin's graduation party a few weeks later, and I went by myself because Marcus had to work that weekend. But I still got weird looks from Linda and my dad. Whenever I smiled or laughed at someone's joke, Jessica was there with a new guy she'd started seeing who seemed nice enough at first. But as the afternoon went on, it became obvious that he was one of those people who thinks he's way smarter than everyone else and needs to correct or contradict everything anyone says in conversation. I watched Jessica hanging on this guy's every word, even when he was being condescending to other people. And I could see my dad and Linda exchanging concerned looks, but they didn't say anything to her about it at the time. Instead, after the party was over, Linda pulled me aside and said she'd noticed that I seemed much more relaxed and pleasant when Marcus wasn't around, and that maybe it would be better if I came to family events solo for a while until Jessica got more settled in her new relationship. I was stunned because that wasn't what we'd agreed on at all, and I told Linda that I thought we were just talking about me being more sensitive, not about excluding Marcus from family events entirely, but she said that his presence seemed to make things harder for Jessica, and that it would only be temporary, until she felt more secure about her own dating life, and that it would really help the family dynamic if I could just go along with this for now. I said absolutely not, because Marcus was my partner and I wasn't going to treat him like some dirty secret just because Jessica couldn't handle seeing other people in happy relationships. Linda got defensive and said I was being selfish and putting my own desires ahead of my sister's emotional well-being, and that if I really cared about Jessica, I would be willing to make this small sacrifice to help her get through a difficult time. But it didn't feel small to me at all, and I told Linda that Jessica was 28 years old and needed to learn how to deal with her own problems instead of expecting everyone else to rearrange their lives around her feelings. Linda said I was being cruel and unsympathetic, and that Jessica had always struggled with relationships and needed support from her family instead of judgment and criticism. I pointed out that it showed that the reason Jessica kept struggling was because my dad and Linda never let her face the consequences of her poor choices, and that always swooping in to rescue her or make everyone else accommodate her problems wasn't actually helping her grow or learn anything. Linda said that was a horrible thing to say about my own sister, and that she couldn't believe I was being so cold and selfish when Jessica needed me the most. The conversation escalated from there, with Linda accusing me of being jealous of the attention Jessica got from my dad and me, pointing out that I was actually trying to live my own independent adult life instead of constantly creating drama that required family intervention. By the end of it, we were both pretty angry, and Linda said maybe I needed to take some time to think about what kind of sister and daughter I wanted to be, and that I was welcome to rejoin family activities when I was ready to be more supportive and less self-centered. I left feeling absolutely terrible because I genuinely couldn't understand how wanting to bring my boyfriend to family events made me selfish or unsupportive. I'd been nothing but patient with Jessica's constant relationship disasters for years, and I'd never made her feel bad about her choices even when they were obviously terrible decisions that anyone could see coming from a mile away. When I told Marcus what happened, he was furious on my behalf and said that my family was being completely unreasonable and manipulative. He said it sounded like they had this unhealthy dynamic where Jessica got to be the center of attention whenever she had problems, and anyone who didn't participate in that drama was treated like they were being mean or unsupportive, and that it wasn't fair to me at all. I didn't hear from my dad or Linda for almost 2 weeks after the confrontation, which was unusual. Because we normally talked or texted at least a few times a week, I kept waiting for one of them to reach out and apologize, or at least try to find some kind of compromise, but my phone stayed quiet, except for occasional texts from Jessica complaining about her new boyfriend and how he was starting to show his true colors. Finally, my dad called me one evening and said he'd been thinking about everything that happened and that he agreed with Linda that I'd been insensitive to Jessica's situation and that maybe some time apart would be good for everyone. He said that, until I was ready to be more considerate of Jessica's feelings and more supportive of the family as a whole, it would be better if I didn't attend family gatherings because my attitude was creating tension and making things harder for everyone else. I asked him if he was seriously telling me not to come to family events because I was too happy in my relationship, and he said that wasn't what this was about, but that my behavior had been selfish and hurtful, and that actions have consequences. I said fine. If that's how he felt about it, then I would respect his wishes and stay away from family events, but that I thought he was making a huge mistake and prioritizing Jessica's inability to handle her own problems over his relationship with me. He said that if I was going to be stubborn and refuse to see how my actions were affecting other people, then maybe some distance would help me gain some perspective on the situation. I said that maybe he was right about the distance part because I was getting tired of being made to feel guilty for having a healthy relationship when everyone else was so focused on enabling Jessica's dysfunction. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my office and just cried for about 20 minutes because I couldn't believe that my own father was essentially banishing me from the family because I wasn't willing to pretend to be miserable to make my half-sister feel better about her poor life choices. It felt like some kind of alternate universe where being happy and stable was treated like a character flaw and where causing constant drama was rewarded with attention and support. Marcus found me when I got home and took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without even asking what was wrong, and I told him the whole conversation while he rubbed my back and let me cry into his shirt. He said that my family was toxic and that I deserved better than to be treated like my happiness was some kind of burden or inconvenience to other people, and that maybe this forced break from them would actually be a good thing because it would give me some space to see how messed up the whole dynamic really was. I thought he might be right about that because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my dad and Linda had always treated Jessica like she was fragile and needed constant protection from reality, while expecting me to be independent and handle my own problems without any support or recognition. Whenever I had relationship troubles in the past, they'd listen politely for a few minutes and then change the subject or give me generic advice about how things would work out eventually. But with Jessica, they'd spend hours analyzing every detail and coming up with elaborate plans to help her feel better.